The sea was calm on the surface, but beneath it lived stories soaked in ambition, violence, and fortune. In the 17th century, when empires stretched their power across oceans and treasure fleets carried unimaginable wealth from the Americas to Europe, there emerged a man whose name would travel faster than the trade winds and strike fear into some of the most fortified cities in the New World. That man was Henry Morgan. To some, he was nothing more than a pirate, a ruthless opportunist driven by gold and glory. To others, he was a strategic genius, a commander capable of turning chaos into victory. Yet what makes Morgan truly extraordinary is not simply the destruction he left behind, nor the riches he accumulated, but the almost unbelievable transformation of his life. Against all expectation, against the logic of empire and law, the man who spent much of his life attacking Spanish territories would not die hunted or forgotten. Instead, he would be welcomed by the English crown, knighted and entrusted with political power in the very region he once terrorized. But long before he became Sir Henry Morgan, before fleets sailed under his command and governors whispered his name with unease, he was merely a young man from the green countryside of Wales, a place far removed from the blazing sun and unpredictable waters of the Caribbean. Very little is known with certainty about Morgan's early years, and that absence of detail has allowed myth to weave itself into his origins. Historians generally agree he was born around 1635, likely into a family of modest means rather than privilege. Opportunities in rural Britain were limited for ambitious young men without inheritance, and for many, the sea represented more than employment, it represented reinvention. Ships offered the possibility of shedding one identity and forging another somewhere beyond the horizon. At some point in his youth, Morgan made a decision that would permanently sever him from the predictable rhythms of land. He chose the uncertainty of the ocean. Life aboard a 17th-century vessel was relentless, shaped by hard labor, strict hierarchies, scarce provisions, and the ever-present threat of storms capable of swallowing entire crews without leaving a trace. Disease spread quickly in cramped quarters, punishments were harsh, and comfort was nearly non-existent. Yet ships were also schools of transformation. Those who paid attention could learn navigation, discipline, combat readiness, and the delicate art of commanding men whose loyalty was often tied directly to profit. Somewhere in those demanding early voyages, Morgan was not merely surviving, he was studying, absorbing, and preparing himself for a future no one around him could yet imagine. By the early 1660s, Morgan arrived in Jamaica, an island that had only recently fallen under English control and was rapidly becoming one of the most strategically valuable outposts in the Caribbean. Jamaica was not simply a colony, it was a frontier of opportunity where ambition was rewarded and moral boundaries often blurred under the pressures of imperial competition. The Spanish Empire still dominated much of the region, transporting vast quantities of silver, gold, spices, and textiles across sea routes that seemed almost designed to tempt attack. Wherever wealth traveled, predators inevitably followed, and the Caribbean soon became a crowded theater of privateers, buccaneers, merchants, soldiers, and fortune seekers. For a man like Morgan, the island offered something priceless: proximity to power and proximity to possibility. It was there that he obtained what was known as a privateering commission, a government authorization permitting him to attack Spanish ships and settlements during periods of conflict. This document effectively transformed acts that might otherwise be called piracy into state-sanctioned warfare. To England, men like Morgan were instruments capable of weakening rival empires without requiring the full deployment of the Royal Navy. To the privateers themselves, these commissions represented legalized opportunity, a chance to claim wealth that could elevate a sailor into a landowner almost overnight. What separated Morgan from many others operating in these dangerous waters was not recklessness, but calculation. While countless captains relied on brute force or impulsive attacks, Morgan demonstrated an unusual patience. He studied defensive patterns, gathered intelligence, evaluated geography, and waited for moments when surprise could multiply the effectiveness of his relatively small forces. Leadership at sea required more than courage. It demanded emotional control and the ability to unify crews composed of men from different nations, backgrounds, and temperaments, all of whom expected reward for the risks they took. Morgan proved adept at cultivating loyalty, and loyalty translated into operational strength. By the late 1660s, he was no longer simply participating in raids organized by others. He was planning them, shaping them, and increasingly defining the tempo of conflict in the region. One of the early demonstrations of his growing capability came with an attack on the inland Cuban settlement, historically known as Camagüey. Rather than approaching in the predictable manner defenders might expect, Morgan guided his forces with deliberate unpredictability, exploiting vulnerabilities before alarms could fully spread. The raid yielded supplies and valuables, but its deeper impact was psychological. News traveled quickly across colonial networks, and fear often accomplished what cannons could not. Merchants began to reconsider routes. Officials worried about defenses. Morgan's name started appearing in conversations far beyond the immediate reach of his ships. Yet it was his assault on Portobello that truly altered the way the Caribbean perceived him. Portobello was not an easy prize. It was one of Spain's principal treasure ports, guarded by formidable fortifications that projected confidence and strength. Many believed it effectively untouchable, protected not only by stone walls but by reputation itself. Morgan recognized that reputations could be shattered. Gathering a determined force, he launched a bold operation that relied heavily on timing and shock. When the attack came, it unfolded with a precision that suggested careful preparation rather than opportunistic chaos. Against expectations, the defenses failed, the city fell, and enormous wealth passed into Morgan's hands. The victory sent a clear and unsettling message throughout Spanish territories. This was not a raider driven solely by impulse, but a commander capable of orchestrating complex assaults. His successes began to blur the line between privateer and military strategist, and Spanish authorities grew increasingly concerned that Morgan represented more than a temporary nuisance. He was becoming a destabilizing force in a region already strained by imperial rivalry. As his reputation expanded, so too did the scale of his ambition. The Caribbean of the 17th century operated in a constant tension between declared war and fragile peace, and diplomatic negotiations between England and Spain introduced an element of uncertainty into Morgan's career. When treaties approached, yesterday's sanctioned attacker could suddenly become tomorrow's criminal liability. Yet momentum is a difficult force to halt, especially for a man surrounded by investors expecting returns, crews hungry for plunder, and a legend that attracted recruits eager to gamble their lives for wealth. Stopping would have required not only restraint, but a willingness to surrender the identity he had forged upon the sea. Morgan showed little inclination toward retreat. Ahead lay new campaigns, greater risks, and deeper incursions into Spanish territory, including operations that would carry him toward the waters near Maracaibo, along the northern coast of Venezuela. There his methods would grow bolder, his name louder, and the consequences of his actions far more difficult for empires to ignore. The transformation from ambitious privateer to living legend had already begun, even if the world had not yet fully grasped what Henry Morgan was becoming. By the time Henry Morgan turned his attention toward the water surrounding Maracaibo, His name was no longer unfamiliar in the Caribbean. It had begun to circulate in merchant correspondence, in the uneasy conversations of Spanish governors, and in the private calculations of ship captains deciding whether to risk certain routes. Reputation in the 17th century could function as both weapon and shield, and Morgan understood that fear itself could weaken resistance before a single cannon fired. The approach toward Maracaibo in 1669 was not reckless but deliberate. The lagoon that connected the city to the open sea created a natural corridor of vulnerability, yet it also posed strategic risk, as retreat could be cut off if Spanish defenses mobilized quickly. Morgan chose to advance regardless, bringing with him a force hardened by previous campaigns and bound together by expectation of reward. For the men under his command, this was not merely another voyage. It was an opportunity to participate in something larger than ordinary plunder. They believed they were sailing with a captain whose fortune was rising, and in such moments belief can be as powerful as artillery. Upon arrival, Morgan's forces moved swiftly to secure control of the surrounding area, understanding that hesitation often gave defenders time to organize. Historical accounts suggest that detachments were sent inland to locate hidden goods and identify individuals who might possess knowledge of concealed wealth. The methods used during these interrogations reflected the brutal norms of 17th century warfare in colonial territories, where restraint was rarely prioritized and intimidation was considered a practical tool of extraction. While modern sensibilities recoil at such tactics, they were tragically common in conflicts of the era, especially in regions where imperial rivalry blurred moral boundaries. What mattered strategically was outcome, and the outcome at Maracaibo was unmistakable. Morgan's forces accumulated substantial treasure and demonstrated once again their capacity to project power far from traditional naval battlefields. The campaign also revealed something critical about Morgan's leadership style. He did not rely solely on surprise assaults. He maintained pressure, extending operations long enough to maximize returns, reinforcing the perception that resistance would be costly and surrender perhaps wiser. Yet Maracaibo also exposed the risks inherent in operating deep within contested waters. Spanish authorities were not passive observers. As Morgan lingered in the region, Spanish warships maneuvered to intercept him near the narrow exit of Lake Maracaibo, threatening to trap his fleet. It was here that Morgan's adaptability became particularly evident. Facing potential encirclement, he employed deception and tactical improvisation to create an escape opportunity. Accounts describe how his forces used a fire ship, a vessel deliberately set ablaze and directed toward enemy ships, to disrupt Spanish formations. Whether embellished or precisely recorded, the essence of the maneuver underscores Morgan's willingness to combine psychological shock with calculated risk. The escape from Maracaibo reinforced a growing narrative. This was a commander who could not easily be cornered. Each time authorities believed they had contained him, he re-emerged elsewhere, wealthier and more emboldened. As Morgan's operations expanded, so too did the scale of his influence. The Caribbean at this time was not a quiet expanse of turquoise serenity, but a geopolitical chessboard where England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands each sought advantage. Morgan's successes weakened Spanish confidence in their defensive network and signaled to other English interests that aggressive action could yield extraordinary profit. Investors in Jamaica and beyond recognized that backing Morgan's expeditions offered returns few other ventures could match. Ships were provisioned, crews recruited, intelligence gathered. Morgan was no longer merely participating in imperial competition, he was shaping its tempo. His ability to coordinate multi-ship operations and maintain cohesion among diverse crews suggested organizational skill beyond that of a typical raider. He operated less like a solitary pirate and more like a commander of a semi-formal naval force whose loyalty rested in personal leadership rather than institutional hierarchy. Yet fame carries consequences. Reports of Morgan's campaigns spread rapidly through Spanish colonial networks, often amplified by rumor and fear. In times of conflict, narratives grow larger than facts, and Morgan's image began to take on mythic dimensions. Some accounts portrayed him as unstoppable, others as merciless, still others as strategically brilliant. The truth likely resided somewhere in between, but perception often matters more than precision. Spanish officials faced mounting pressure to respond decisively, not only to protect commerce but to preserve imperial prestige. Allowing repeated incursions without visible retaliation risked signaling weakness across the Atlantic world. Meanwhile, in England, Morgan's reputation was more complicated. On one hand, he was undermining a rival empire. On the other, diplomatic negotiations with Spain were evolving, and unofficial aggression could destabilize fragile agreements. The very qualities that made Morgan valuable in wartime threatened to become liabilities in peace. Despite these shifting political winds, Morgan's ambition did not diminish. If anything, his previous successes fueled a conviction that greater victories were possible. By 1670, he began organizing what would become the most audacious campaign of his career, an operation directed not at a peripheral settlement but at one of Spain's most significant colonial cities, Panama City. The logistical complexity alone was staggering. The expedition would require assembling one of the largest privateering forces the Caribbean had yet seen, coordinating dozens of vessels, and sustaining a march across dense tropical terrain once landfall was made. Many seasoned observers considered the plan excessively ambitious. Yet ambition had defined Morgan's rise from the beginning. He had repeatedly demonstrated that what appeared impractical could become possible when preparation, timing, and audacity converged. The march toward Panama would test not only his tactical abilities but also the loyalty and endurance of his men. Tropical heat, disease, and scarce provisions turned the jungle into an adversary as formidable as any Spanish regiment. Still, Morgan pressed forward, maintaining momentum through a combination of authority and the promise of extraordinary reward. When his forces finally confronted Spanish defenders near the city, the outcome would reverberate across the Atlantic world. Panama was more than a port. It was a symbol of Spanish dominance in the Americas, a node through which immense wealth passed en route to Europe. To challenge it directly was to challenge imperial confidence itself. What followed would mark the peak of Morgan's military audacity and simultaneously set in motion the political consequences that would eventually carry him far from the jungles of Central America and into the courtrooms and chambers of England. For now, however, the sea still belonged to him. His fleet moved with the confidence of men who believed fortune favored their captain. Each victory layered upon the last, creating a narrative of inevitability that surrounded Morgan like an invisible current. Yet history rarely allows such momentum to continue unchecked. The same empire that had once authorized his aggression would soon question its timing, and the same daring that elevated him to legend would threaten to bring him before judgment. The stage was set for the most dramatic transformation of his life, a transformation that would blur the boundary between outlaw and official, between condemnation and honor. And as Morgan advanced toward Panama, neither he nor his enemies could yet foresee how profoundly the consequences of that decision would reshape his destiny. The march toward Panama City was not the kind of operation typically associated with pirates. It was not a sudden coastal raid followed by a rapid escape into open waters. It was something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. To reach the city, Henry Morgan and his assembled force of more than 1,000 men would need to abandon the relative familiarity of their ships and move inland across the Isthmus of Panama, navigating dense jungle terrain that seemed determined to swallow armies whole. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with humidity and alive with insects. Rivers cut unpredictable paths through the landscape, supplies dwindled, and hunger became an increasingly constant companion. Yet Morgan pressed forward, aware that retreat would fracture morale and that momentum was his most valuable asset. Leadership in such conditions required more than boldness. It demanded the ability to project certainty even when uncertainty dominated every horizon. The Spanish, alerted to Morgan's advance, attempted to fortify their defenses and assemble resistance. Panama was no minor settlement. It functioned as a critical artery of Spanish wealth, a transit hub through which silver from Peru and goods from across the Pacific flowed toward Europe. To lose it, even temporarily, would represent not merely financial damage but a symbolic wound to imperial authority. As Morgan's men emerged from the jungle's edge and approached the plains outside the city, the confrontation that followed carried weight far beyond the battlefield itself. Accounts describe a tense engagement in which Spanish forces, including cavalry, attempted to repel the attackers. Yet Morgan's troops, hardened by previous campaigns and motivated by the expectation of immense reward, held formation and pressed their advantage. When the battle concluded, Panama lay vulnerable. The capture of the city was both triumph and turning point. Fires broke out during the chaos that followed, and much of the settlement was consumed in destruction. Whether the flames were deliberately set, accidental, or the result of defensive measures remains debated by historians, but the effect was undeniable. The once prosperous city was reduced to ruin. Morgan's men gathered what treasure they could secure, though some accounts suggest that far less wealth was found than anticipated, possibly removed in advance by Spanish authorities. Even so, the symbolic impact of the raid eclipsed its material yield. Morgan had done what many considered unthinkable. He had struck at one of Spain's most vital colonial centers and emerged victorious. Yet, as the smoke drifted above the remains of Panama, a different storm was gathering across the Atlantic. Unknown to many involved in the expedition, diplomatic agreements between England and Spain had already shifted the political landscape. The Treaty of Madrid, signed in 1670, sought to stabilize relations between the two empires and reduce unauthorized hostilities in the Caribbean. Morgan's assault on Panama, occurring in the shadow of this fragile peace, suddenly transformed from celebrated aggression into diplomatic embarrassment. Spain demanded accountability. English officials, eager to preserve the treaty and avoid escalation, could not simply ignore the outrage. The same daring that had elevated Morgan to legendary status now placed him in a precarious position. When Morgan eventually returned to Jamaica, the atmosphere was different from his earlier triumphant arrivals. While many colonists and investors still admired his accomplishments, imperial politics operate on calculations beyond personal loyalty. Orders were issued. Morgan was to be arrested and sent to England. The voyage back across the Atlantic must have carried a tension unlike any he had previously experienced. For years he had commanded ships as master of his own destiny. Now he sailed under custody, uncertain whether he would be condemned as a pirate who had violated peace or defended as a servant of English interests. Upon arrival in England, Morgan was reportedly held for a period, with some accounts placing him in confinement associated with the Tower of London. Whether his detention was severe or largely procedural remains debated, but symbolically the image is powerful. The feared raider of Spanish America confined within the ancient stone walls that had held traitors and nobles alike. Yet Morgan's story would not conclude with disgrace. Public perception in England proved far more sympathetic than Spanish diplomats might have hoped. Many English citizens viewed Morgan not as a criminal, but as a bold adversary of a long-standing rival empire. His victories had disrupted Spanish dominance and enriched English colonial interests. In the complex calculus of empire, such results carried weight. King Charles II faced a decision balancing diplomacy and domestic sentiment. Ultimately, the outcome astonished observers across Europe. Rather than subject Morgan to harsh punishment, the crown extended favor. In 1674, Henry Morgan was knighted. The transformation was extraordinary. The man who had marched through jungle and overseen the fall of Panama now bore the title Sir. His knighthood signaled not merely forgiveness but endorsement, an acknowledgement that whatever diplomatic tensions existed, his actions had aligned sufficiently with English strategic interests to merit honor rather than exile. Morgan returned to Jamaica not as a rogue adventurer but as lieutenant governor, entrusted with maintaining order in the very region where he had once orchestrated raids. The irony was profound. He was now responsible for suppressing the same forms of unauthorized piracy that had defined his ascent. The shift from aggressor to administrator required adaptation. Governance demanded negotiation, legal oversight, and restraint rather than audacious strikes. While some former comrades may have viewed the transformation with skepticism, Morgan embraced his new role with the authority of a man who understood the mechanisms of power from both sides. Yet power does not halt time. As years passed, Morgan's health began to decline. Contemporary accounts describe a man increasingly affected by illness, possibly exacerbated by heavy drinking, a habit not uncommon in Caribbean port life. The bustling harbor of Port Royal, once a stage for departing expeditions and triumphant returns, became the backdrop of his later years. There, amid merchants, sailors, and officials, the former privateer navigated the slower rhythms of administration and personal reflection. Wealth had brought status, but it could not shield him from physical deterioration. In 1688, Henry Morgan died at approximately 53 years of age. His funeral was conducted with the honors befitting a respected colonial leader, a striking contrast to the lawless image that had once defined him. Yet even in death, legend followed. In 1692, a devastating earthquake struck Port Royal, causing large portions of the city to sink beneath the sea. Stories soon circulated that Morgan's burial site had been claimed by the ocean, as though the waters themselves had reclaimed the man who had spent his life upon them. Whether literal truth or poetic embellishment, the symbolism endures. The sea had shaped his rise, carried his fleets, witnessed his battles, and perhaps in the end, erased the final physical trace of his resting place. Henry Morgan's life resists simple categorization. He was neither purely hero nor purely villain, but a product of an era defined by imperial rivalry, economic ambition, and shifting moral landscapes. He demonstrated strategic brilliance, ruthless pragmatism, and political adaptability rare among men who began as private adventurers. His transformation from obscure Welsh sailor to knighted colonial governor illustrates how fluid identity could be in a century when power frequently outweighed principle and results overshadowed restraint. The Caribbean remembers him as a force of disruption. England recorded him as a servant of the crown. Between those interpretations lies the enduring fascination that has carried his name across centuries, and yet the deeper question lingers beyond titles and treasure. Was Morgan shaped by his era, or did he help shape it? Did empire create men like him, or did men like him accelerate empire's reach? The answers ripple outward like waves from a passing ship, never fully settling. What remains certain is that few individuals of the 17th century navigated the currents between outlaw and authority with such dramatic success. Henry Morgan did not merely survive the dangerous world of Caribbean conflict, he mastered it, redefined it, and ultimately stepped beyond it, carrying with him a legacy as turbulent and compelling as the waters that first carried him away from Wales. By the time Henry Morgan settled into his role as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, the Caribbean itself was changing. The age of improvisational conquest that had defined the mid-17th century was gradually giving way to more structured imperial administration. European crowns were beginning to recognize that while privateers and buccaneers could weaken rivals, they also introduced instability that threatened long-term commercial ambitions. Sugar plantations were expanding, enslaved labor systems were intensifying, and colonial economies were becoming increasingly organized around predictable trade rather than opportunistic plunder. Morgan, once a symbol of disruption, now found himself positioned within the machinery of governance, expected to uphold order rather than undermine it. The transformation required not only political adaptation but psychological adjustment. The man who had thrived in uncertainty now had to manage it. Jamaica in the 1670s and 1680s was no quiet tropical outpost. It was a dynamic and often volatile society composed of English settlers, merchants, former privateers, enslaved Africans, free people of mixed heritage, and transient sailors who passed through ports like Port Royal, a city that had earned a reputation as one of the wealthiest and most unruly in the Western Hemisphere. Taverns lined its streets, fortunes changed hands rapidly, and news from Europe arrived with every ship. Morgan operated within this environment as both authority figure and living legend. His past lent him credibility among those who had once sailed similar paths, but it also carried the burden of expectation. Some likely assumed he would remain sympathetic to privateering ventures. Others may have questioned whether a former raider could truly enforce restraint upon men motivated by profit and adventure. Colonial administration demanded compromise. Morgan participated in councils, addressed disputes, and navigated the competing interests of plantation owners, merchants, and imperial directives from London. The Caribbean was no longer merely a theater of war. It was becoming an economic engine, and stability mattered more than spectacle. Yet beneath the surface, tensions persisted. Former privateers did not easily abandon habits forged through years of sanctioned aggression. Spain remained a rival, even if treaties temporarily reduced open hostility. The balance between diplomacy and defense required careful calibration. Morgan's experience gave him insight into how maritime raiders thought, how they organized, and how they exploited weaknesses. In this sense, his controversial past became a strategic asset for maintaining security. However, the personal dimension of Morgan's later years cannot be ignored. Wealth and title did not erase the physical toll of decades spent in harsh environments. Contemporary descriptions suggest that his health deteriorated steadily, with references to dropsy, a term historically associated with fluid retention often linked to liver disease. Whether caused by illness, diet, or prolonged alcohol consumption, the decline contrasted sharply with the vigorous image of the commander who once marched across the Isthmus of Panama. Aging can be particularly striking in individuals whose identities were built upon action and command. For Morgan, the shift from battlefield decision-making to administrative oversight may have carried a quiet introspection rarely recorded in official documents. The sea that once symbolized opportunity now represented memory. Beyond his individual life, Morgan's career contributed to broader shifts in imperial policy. His success demonstrated the effectiveness of semi-independent maritime forces in destabilizing enemy economies, but it also highlighted the diplomatic risks such operations carried once peace negotiations emerged. European powers gradually moved toward more centralized naval strategies, strengthening formal fleets rather than relying heavily on private commissions. In this sense, Morgan belongs to a transitional generation, one foot in the era of loosely organized buccaneers, the other in a future defined by standing navies and structured colonial administration. His knighthood symbolized not merely personal redemption but the absorption of frontier aggression into official authority. The legend of Morgan also expanded beyond historical record into cultural memory. Stories circulated among sailors, embellished in taverns, reshaped with each retelling. The image of the cunning Welshman who defied Spanish fortresses and returned home not in chains but in honor proved irresistible to storytellers. In time, his name would become associated with rum, adventure, and a romanticized vision of Caribbean piracy that softened the harsher realities of colonial conflict. Yet beneath these layers of myth remains a complex figure shaped by ambition, opportunity, and the volatile currents of empire. He neither fully rejected nor fully transcended the violence of his era. Instead, he navigated it with pragmatic intelligence. When the earthquake struck Port Royal in 1692, 4 years after Morgan's death, it shattered one of the most prosperous ports in the New World. Buildings collapsed, sections of the city slid into the sea, and thousands perished in what survivors described as apocalyptic devastation. Though Morgan did not live to witness the catastrophe, the event intertwined symbolically with his legacy. The idea that the ocean reclaimed the city, and perhaps his burial site, reinforced the enduring connection between his life and the waters that had defined it. Nature itself seemed to erase the physical traces of an era marked by ambition and excess, leaving behind only memory and story. In examining Morgan's legacy, historians often confront a tension between condemnation and admiration. From a modern perspective, the brutality associated with Caribbean raiding campaigns is impossible to ignore, as is the broader context of colonial exploitation and human suffering that framed them. Yet within the 17th century geopolitical landscape, Morgan's actions were neither isolated nor unique. He operated within systems designed to reward aggression against rival empires, systems that blurred moral clarity in favor of strategic advantage. To judge him solely by contemporary standards risks oversimplification. To excuse his actions entirely risks romanticization. The truth lies in acknowledging both his strategic brilliance and the costs borne by those who faced his campaigns. Perhaps what continues to fascinate scholars and audiences alike is not merely what Morgan did, but how completely he altered his trajectory. Few figures in maritime history illustrate so vividly the fluid boundaries between outlaw and official, between chaos and governance. His life underscores a recurring theme in imperial expansion. Power often absorbs what it cannot eliminate. The privateer who once unsettled Spanish dominance became an instrument of English stability. The raider who inspired fear became a symbol of colonial authority. In that transformation resides the enduring complexity of Henry Morgan's story. And still, centuries later, his name drifts across historical discourse like a ship appearing through morning fog. He embodies the contradictions of his time, ambition intertwined with violence, loyalty interwoven with opportunism, honor layered upon aggression. The Caribbean he helped shape has long since evolved, yet the echoes of that turbulent century remain embedded in its history. As waves continue to break along the shores of Jamaica and Panama, they carry with them the memory of a man who once rode those waters toward fortune, controversy, and an ending as enigmatic as the sea itself. To understand Henry Morgan fully, one must step beyond the dramatic imagery of burning cities and captured treasure and examine the psychological and economic forces that shaped men like him. The 17th century Caribbean was not merely a stage for adventure, it was a pressure chamber where ambition, survival, imperial rivalry and personal reinvention collided. Privateering existed at the intersection of legality and opportunism. Governments issued commissions not out of moral conviction, but because outsourcing warfare was economically efficient. Ships were expensive to build and maintain, sailors costly to train and feed. By granting legal permission to independent captains to attack enemy commerce, crowns could weaken rivals while shifting financial risk onto private investors. Success meant shared profit. Failure meant private loss. In such a system, men like Henry Morgan were not aberrations, they were logical outcomes. Morgan's rise illustrates how adaptable individuals could exploit this environment. Unlike the romanticized pirate of later fiction, the privateer operated within contracts, negotiated shares, and maintained structured hierarchies aboard ship. Crews often signed agreements outlining distribution of plunder, compensation for injury, and discipline standards. In many ways, these ships functioned as floating corporations driven by high-risk investment. Morgan's ability to coordinate large expeditions, attract financial backing, and maintain loyalty among volatile crews suggests that he possessed not only battlefield instincts but administrative competence. He understood incentive structures. He recognized that morale depended on predictable reward. A captain who failed to distribute wealth fairly risked mutiny as surely as one who failed to navigate safely through reefs. The economics of Caribbean raiding were staggering. Spanish America generated immense quantities of silver, particularly from mines in Peru and Mexico, much of which passed through transit points like Panama City before crossing the Atlantic. Even a small percentage intercepted could transform fortunes. This concentration of wealth created vulnerability. No empire, however vast, could perfectly defend every shipment, every port, every inland route. Morgan's genius lay partly in identifying moments when defenses were stretched thin or confidence had grown complacent. Surprise was not merely tactical, it was economic disruption. By targeting symbolic centers of wealth, he forced Spain to divert resources toward defense, increasing the cost of empire itself. Yet Morgan was not alone in this world. The Caribbean hosted numerous figures who pursued similar paths, though few achieved his combination of audacity and political rehabilitation. Buccaneers often operated from shared bases, cooperating temporarily before diverging towards separate objectives. Alliances formed and dissolved rapidly, shaped by profit potential rather than ideological unity. In this fluid environment, reputation became currency. Morgan cultivated an image of decisiveness and calculated boldness. Such an image attracted experienced fighters willing to entrust their fate to his leadership. It also amplified fear among adversaries, sometimes producing surrender without prolonged confrontation. The psychological dimension of maritime conflict cannot be overstated. In a world where communication was slow and rumor pervasive, stories of prior victories could undermine morale long before cannons thundered. Comparisons between Morgan and later pirates such as Edward Teach reveal important distinctions. While Teach, known widely as Blackbeard, operated primarily outside formal government sanction and cultivated a theatrical persona designed to intimidate, Morgan's career unfolded within a more ambiguous framework of imperial authorization. Morgan sought legitimacy alongside profit. His willingness to transition into governance suggests that, at least in part, he viewed his actions as aligned with broader English interests rather than purely personal rebellion. This distinction does not erase the violence associated with his campaigns, but it contextualizes his ambitions. He was not striving to dismantle empire, he was maneuvering within it. The transformation from privateer to colonial official also illuminates a recurring pattern in imperial history. Frontier aggression often precedes institutional consolidation. Once territories are destabilized and rivals weakened, governments move to formalize control, reduce unpredictability, and standardize commerce. Morgan's appointment as lieutenant governor of Jamaica symbolized this shift. The crown effectively absorbed the disruptive force he represented and redirected it toward maintenance of order. The message was subtle but powerful. Enterprise that advances national interest may be forgiven, even rewarded, when circumstances align. In this sense, Morgan's knighthood was not an anomaly but a strategic recalibration. Yet the moral contradictions remain. The wealth extracted during Caribbean raids often depended upon systems of exploitation embedded deeply within colonial economies, including forced labor and the suffering of indigenous and enslaved populations. Morgan operated in a world structured by these inequalities, benefiting from them as did nearly all European colonial actors of his era. A comprehensive assessment of his life must therefore acknowledge not only his strategic acumen but the broader human costs surrounding imperial expansion. The Caribbean was a crossroads of opportunity for some and devastation for others. Morgan's story cannot be isolated from that dual reality. As decades passed after his death, Morgan's image evolved. In British narratives, he sometimes appeared as a bold defender of Protestant interests against Catholic Spain. In Caribbean folklore, he lingered as a formidable sea captain whose name inspired both admiration and caution. Commercial enterprises in later centuries appropriated his identity, transforming a complex historical figure into a marketable emblem of adventure. Such reinterpretations reveal how societies reshape the past to suit contemporary tastes. The harsher edges of his campaigns softened in popular memory, replaced by a broader fascination with pirate lore. Yet beneath these reinterpretations lies a documented trajectory that remains remarkable even without embellishment. A Welsh youth of modest origin who navigated violence, diplomacy, ambition, and adaptation to ascend into knighthood. Ultimately, Henry Morgan's life invites reflection on power itself, power at sea, power within empire, power over narrative. He mastered the first through tactical innovation and psychological awareness. He negotiated the second by aligning his ambitions with national interest when opportunity allowed. And he achieved the third through a transformation so dramatic that it ensured his name would endure long after the ships he commanded had rotted into the ocean floor. The Caribbean he sailed has changed, the empires he challenged have faded, yet the arc of his life continues to fascinate because it reveals how fluid identity can become in times of upheaval. The sea does not preserve monuments in stone. It erases tracks, scatters wreckage, and dissolves boundaries. And yet, paradoxically, it preserves stories. As long as waves continue to move across the waters between Wales, Jamaica, Venezuela, and Panama, the memory of Henry Morgan remains carried within them. Not as a simple legend of piracy, but as a testament to an era when ambition could redraw the map of a man's destiny as swiftly as wind fills a sail. By the time Henry Morgan's health began to fail in the 1680s, the Caribbean he had once dominated was already beginning to change. The era that had allowed men like him to thrive was narrowing. European powers were no longer content to rely solely on semi-independent raiders to weaken their rivals. They were building stronger, more centralized naval systems capable of projecting sustained power across oceans. The chaos that had once defined the Caribbean frontier gradually yielded to bureaucracy, treaties, and expanding imperial administration. In many ways, Morgan belonged to a transitional generation, one that bridged the gap between the raw opportunism of early colonial expansion and the structured imperial governance that followed. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670 between England and Spain had formally recognized English possessions in the Caribbean, including Jamaica. While hostilities did not vanish overnight, The agreement signaled a shift toward diplomatic stabilization. For privateers, this shift was dangerous. When governments pursue peace, freelance warfare becomes inconvenient. Morgan himself experienced this tension firsthand when he was arrested and transported to England after the Panama raid. Yet his eventual knighthood demonstrated something crucial. The Crown valued results more than procedural purity. His actions, though diplomatically awkward, had undeniably weakened Spanish dominance and strengthened English influence. Still, the message to future buccaneers was clear. The window for semi-sanctioned plunder would not remain open forever. As England invested more heavily in its Royal Navy, the need for private maritime aggression diminished. Permanent fleets could patrol trade routes, escort merchant convoys, and defend colonies without relying on unpredictable captains, driven primarily by personal profit. The professionalization of naval warfare marked the slow decline of the buccaneer era. In this evolving landscape, Morgan's transformation from raider to administrator appears almost prophetic. He sensed, whether consciously or instinctively, that survival required adaptation. Remaining permanently outside institutional power would have been risky. Entering the colonial elite secured his legacy and insulated him from the very crackdowns that later swallowed less fortunate pirates. Meanwhile, across the Caribbean and Atlantic, piracy did not disappear. It transformed. The so-called Golden Age of Piracy, which would rise in the early 18th century, differed from Morgan's era in important ways. Figures such as Edward Teach, Charles Vane, and Bartholomew Roberts operated largely outside official sanction. They were not instruments of empire in the same structured way Morgan had been. Instead, many of them were former sailors displaced by war's end, men accustomed to prize-taking who suddenly found themselves unemployed in peacetime. Without legal commissions, they turned fully rogue. Their defiance was less politically strategic and more openly rebellious. Where Morgan had negotiated with governors, these later pirates rejected them outright. This distinction highlights Morgan's complexity. He was neither a pure criminal nor a purely loyal servant of the crown. He was something in between, a pragmatist navigating unstable waters. His story complicates modern assumptions about piracy as simple lawlessness. In the 17th century, legality itself was fluid. A man could be celebrated in one port and condemned in another. A signed commission could transform plunder into patriotic duty. Remove the document, and the same act became piracy punishable by hanging. Morgan understood this fluidity and maneuvered within it with remarkable precision. In Jamaica, as lieutenant governor, Morgan reportedly took part in efforts to suppress unauthorized piracy, an irony not lost on historians. The former privateer now found himself discouraging the very behaviors that had once elevated him. Yet this shift was consistent with imperial consolidation. Stability was now more profitable than chaos. Sugar plantations expanded, trade networks matured, investors preferred predictable returns over spectacular but destabilizing raids. The Caribbean economy was integrating more tightly into global commerce. Lawless unpredictability threatened that integration. Morgan's final years, shadowed by illness and heavy drinking, carry a tone of fading thunder. Once he had commanded fleets and shaped imperial anxieties, now he moved through taverns in Port Royal, his reputation preceding him like an echo from another era. Port Royal itself, notorious for wealth, vice, and excess, symbolized both the prosperity and moral ambiguity of the Caribbean frontier. It was said to be one of the richest cities in the New World, filled with merchants, sailors, traders, and adventurers who rode the waves of empire's expansion. Morgan's presence there was fitting. He embodied the city's dual identity, opportunity intertwined with violence. When he died in 1688, his funeral was reportedly conducted with full honors befitting a knight and colonial official. Cannons fired in salute, ships lowered their flags. The ceremony marked not merely the passing of a man, but the end of a chapter in Caribbean history. Within a few years, nature itself would dramatically alter the landscape. In 1692, an earthquake devastated Port Royal, sending large sections of the city sinking into the sea. Though Morgan had already been buried, legends soon intertwined his story with the catastrophe. Tales circulated that the ocean had claimed his remains, dragging them into the depths, an ending poetically aligned with the life he had lived. Whether fact or embellishment, the imagery persisted, the sea reclaiming one of its fiercest sons. History often simplifies individuals into symbols, but Morgan resists easy categorization. To Spain, he was a ruthless aggressor. To many English contemporaries, he was a defender of national interest. To later generations, he became a figure of romantic intrigue. Yet beneath these shifting interpretations lies a consistent theme: adaptability. Morgan thrived because he read the currents, political, economic, and psychological, as skillfully as he read the wind. He recognized when to strike and when to negotiate, when to advance and when to retreat into legitimacy. The Caribbean of today bears little resemblance to the contested waters of the 17th century, yet the echoes of that period remain embedded in its cultural memory. Fortresses still stand along coastlines once threatened by raiders. Archives preserve correspondence between governors debating the fine line between heroism and criminality. And across literature and film, pirate mythology continues to captivate audiences who sense that within these stories lies something larger than treasure hunts, a meditation on freedom, power, and the cost of ambition. Henry Morgan's life offers a lens into that meditation. He was shaped by empire and helped shape it in return. He exploited violence but also institutionalized authority. He navigated moral gray zones not as an exception but as a product of his age. And in doing so, he secured a legacy that stretches far beyond the Caribbean tides he once commanded. The sea, indifferent yet eternal, continues its rhythm. Ships now cross those waters under vastly different flags, guided by satellite and steel rather than canvas and compass. But if one listens closely to the wind along the shores of Jamaica or the old routes toward Panama, there lingers a whisper of that earlier century, of cannon smoke rising over tropical harbors, of sails tightening before battle, and of a Welsh privateer who understood that history favors those bold enough to seize the moment before it slips beneath the waves. There is something haunting about men like Henry Morgan, something that lingers long after the cannons fall silent and the smoke clears from forgotten harbors. His life forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about history, that greatness and brutality have often walked side by side, indistinguishable in the eyes of those who benefited from their outcomes. Morgan did not see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a servant of opportunity, a man born into a century where empires clashed like storms and survival depended on decisiveness rather than mercy. The Caribbean was not yet a paradise of postcards and tourism. It was a contested frontier, raw and unstable, where allegiance could shift with the tide and fortune favored those willing to risk everything. When we picture the 17th century sea, we must imagine not romance but tension. Wooden hulls groaning under tropical heat, crews hardened by hunger and ambition, the ever-present possibility of betrayal, mutiny, or sudden death. Morgan rose within this unforgiving world because he understood its rules better than most. He grasped that fear could be a weapon as powerful as gunpowder, that reputation could conquer before steel ever clashed. By the time his ships appeared on the horizon, many towns were already half defeated by rumor alone. In an era without instant communication, stories traveled faster than fleets, and Morgan's name became a storm cloud in itself. Yet what makes his story endure is not simply the violence or the treasure, but the transformation. He began as a servant at sea, a man with little authority, and ended as Sir Henry Morgan, knighted by the very monarchy that had once detained him. This arc, from obscurity to power, reflects the volatile fluidity of colonial society. The New World was a place where social hierarchies could be rewritten, where audacity sometimes outweighed pedigree. Morgan's life became proof that the boundaries between outlaw and official rebel and ruler were far thinner than polite society preferred to admit. There is deep irony in the fact that the man who once terrorized Spanish strongholds later helped govern Jamaica under the English crown. The same hands that directed raids would eventually sign administrative documents. The same voice that once commanded boarding parties would deliberate colonial policy. It was not redemption in a moral sense, but evolution in a political one. Morgan recognized that the age of unchecked privateering was fading, and he repositioned himself before the tide turned against him. Many pirates who followed in later decades would not be so fortunate. They would hang from gallows as warnings, their bodies displayed as symbols of imperial order reasserted. His death in 1688 did not silence debate about his character. To some, he remained a hero who weakened Spanish dominance and secured English power in the Caribbean. To others, he was a ruthless aggressor whose methods crossed the line from warfare into cruelty. The truth, as with most figures of turbulent eras, lies somewhere in the shadows between. He was a product of expansionist ambition, of mercantile rivalry, of a world that normalized violence as a tool of policy. Judging him solely by modern standards risks oversimplification. Absolving him entirely risks ignoring suffering. History demands we hold both realities at once, and then there is the sea itself, the ultimate witness. It carried his ships, swallowed his enemies, and eventually reclaimed the city that celebrated him. When Port Royal partially sank beneath the waves in 1692, it felt to many like poetic justice or divine commentary on excess and greed. Whether Morgan's remains were truly disturbed by that catastrophe matters less than the symbolism people attach to the idea. The ocean, vast and impartial, has a way of erasing certainty. Empires rise along its edges and fall into its depths. Names once feared across continents become footnotes, then legends, then whispers. Today, centuries later, Henry Morgan's name survives not only in archives but in popular imagination. His story circulates in books, documentaries, and maritime lore, reshaped by each generation that revisits it. What fascinates us is not merely the treasure he seized, but the audacity with which he navigated a violent century. We are drawn to figures who operate at the edge of legality because they reveal the mechanics of power stripped of polite disguise. Morgan exposed how empire functioned in practice through calculated aggression, strategic diplomacy, and the relentless pursuit of advantage. If we listen closely beyond the myth and exaggeration, we hear a more sobering lesson. The same qualities that build influence can sow destruction. The same ambition that elevates can corrode. Morgan gained wealth, status, and recognition, yet his later years were marked by illness and heavy drinking, a quieter decline far removed from triumphant cannon fire. The arc of his life mirrors the arc of the Caribbean itself during that era. Explosive growth, staggering violence, sudden transformation. Perhaps that is why his story resonates so powerfully with an older audience. It is not simply an adventure tale. It is a reflection on consequence, on how nations justify actions in the name of security, on how individuals rationalize cruelty when it serves ambition, on how history rewards outcomes more readily than methods. Morgan stands at the intersection of these themes, neither fully condemned nor fully celebrated, but undeniably influential. And so we end where all maritime stories ultimately end, with the horizon. Imagine the Caribbean at dusk, the sky bleeding into shades of gold and deep blue, the wind moving gently across waters once churned by battle. Somewhere beyond sight lies the memory of sails cutting through mist, of cannon fire echoing against stone fortresses, of a Welsh privateer who rose from obscurity to shape the destiny of empires. The sea no longer carries his fleet, yet it still carries his echo. Henry Morgan's life reminds us that history is rarely clean. It is written in salt water and smoke, in ambition and consequence, and like the tide, it continues to move, reshaping the shoreline of memory with each passing generation.